This episode is going to be a little bit different than what I normally do, because what I do for influencers is I go through a different artist that has influenced my life in a big way over the last 50 or so years. This artist is weird because I came into them in the middle of their career, then went back and found earlier stuff, and of course there was later stuff. And it was all done in a very different way. There's different sounds for each era. I'm going to go over what I do have. I'm going to go over what I don't have but am very familiar with and I stream all the time, and explain why I consider them important influencers in my life. This week on Influencers, the trio known as the Brothers Gibb, Bee Gees. This is the show where I talk about the artists that have influenced me throughout my entire life. The people I love, the people I listen to, the people I go back to, and why I do. This is Influencers. I'm TC Kirkham, TKR Video Central, and the Kirkham Report. This week on Influencers, we're going to talk about Barry, Robin, and Maurice, the Bee Gees, Brothers Gibb. And we're going to do it in a weird way. Now, I have a lot of stuff on vinyl, but I'm not going to dig it out. I'm going to use Magic Box because it's so scattershot. I don't have everything, but I do listen to everything on streaming. The reason is I have always had an influence by them. When I was younger, say, when I first started buying records in a major way, I was 6 or 7. Before that, we're talking the late 60s, I was familiar with their music but didn't realize who it was. I had heard New York Mining Disaster 1941. I knew I Started a Joke. I knew Massachusetts. Those were songs that were on the radio when I was a kid, and I really didn't connect them with anybody particular until later. The first record I ever bought by Bee Gees on my own was their 1971 comeback smash, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? It was a #1 hit on Billboard, their first, actually. And I remember really liking the song, and it did kind of steer me back toward the pop ways. But they didn't really have a major influence on my life at that time yet either. I had that one song. I actually traded the 45 with somebody else less than 6 months later. And then in 1973, Warner Special Products released a 4-album set called Superstars of the 70s. It was the first volume of what became, I think, 3 or 4. It was sold 4 albums in a box, no sleeves, which I thought was really stupid. And it was a variety of hits that have had songs that acts that have had hits on Warner Brothers or their subsidiaries over the years, and in this case they were drawing from the entire WEA catalog. WEA was the umbrella company around Warner Brothers, Elektra, Asylum, and Atlantic Atco. The brothers were, of course, on Atco Records most of their early years, and that particular collection contained 2 of their comeback hits, To Love Somebody and Lonely Days. They quickly became 2 of my favorite tracks on this collection that included Judy Collins, Stephen Stills, Jimi Hendrix. Yes, it's a great... I tried to find the commercial on YouTube, but I couldn't because I remember the TV commercial for it. And those songs were included as part of this set. And that's when I first became major league interested in the Bee Gees. I went back and picked up an oldie 45 of How Can You Mend a Broken Heart. I went back to get a couple of the other 45s I'd seen hanging out in my used 45 bins in local stores. And I began to look into their music a little bit more carefully. Now, being under 10, or 10 or under at that age, 1973, I was 10, I wasn't able to go back and get a lot of their earlier albums. If I did, it would have been all scratchy, crappy copies. But I had mostly older relatives or babysitters that had some of their earlier stuff. And I would ask them to play it for me. And I quickly fell in love with Robin's incredible vibrato voice and Barry's normally, normal voice, as well as what later became his monster falsetto. It was the beginning of a relationship with the Brothers Gibb that I would tease for a number of years. The tease became true fandom with the release of 1975's Main Course. Main Course was their third album for RSO Records. I did a whole show on LabelNova about RSO, and they're a big part of it if you want to go over and check it out. Owned by their manager, Robert Stigwood, the RSO label was home to a lot of cool artists over the years. At that time, they were best known for Eric Clapton. And they released two albums that didn't do so well for RSO. And Robert and their producer, Arif Martin, who is an Atlantic catalog producer, was pushing them toward R&B. It was what they were doing well. It's what they liked to listen to. And they had previously been compared to the Beatles and the Kinks back in the 60s. Main Course was their first R&B flavored album. I mean, it's not a bad album at all. In fact, I named it one of my favorite albums of 1975, one of my top albums that year. I happened to win a copy of Main Course from KVI AM in Seattle. They had a phone-in line. They were an easy listening station, and they had a phone-in line where they would play a song from a new album, and the best comment on it won the album. Well, I wrote down what my mom said, and she won. And so a couple days later, it arrived in the mail, and complete with the little promotional sticker on it. And that album, of course, had some of their biggest hits of all time: Jive Talkin', Nights on Broadway, and Fanny Be Tender With Your Love. It also included a song that would go on to become a hit for Olivia Newton-John, Come On Over, and a number of other songs that were not hits, that were just typical great Bee Gees material. Side 1 was mostly danceable. Side 2, mostly ballads, except for Edge of the Universe. Some of them even country-tinged. It was fascinating. I played that album all summer long. That one and the Captain's Neil and Carpenter's Horizon. Those were the three albums I played mostly in 1975. It was a great album, and it introduced me in a big way to the sound of the Bee Gees. Now, while Jive Talkin' was their biggest hit off that album, my favorite song was Nights on Broadway. I love the way that song was put together. That's another one where you hear both Barry and Robin doing the vocals, and it's really fantastic. And then they had that really slow, soft bridge in the middle. I love tempo changes on songs like that, and it's really an incredible song, and it would probably rank in one of my on a top 100 to 200 songs of all time on my list. Several other songs would. And I loved Wind of Change, the song that won me the album through what I told Mom to say. Great stuff. If you want to hear that full story, go look at Vinyl Recall 1975. But this was the introduction I had been waiting for. Now, I was familiar with the earlier stuff, but I hadn't listened to a lot of it. I'd heard a couple of their albums. I heard the Best Of album. One of my babysitters happened to have, I think it was Cucumber Castle, the album that just Robin and Maurice did after Barry and Maurice did after Robin left for a while. That one I didn't care for, but the rest of them I had heard were really good. And I had the album with Massachusetts on it. It had been given to me by my cousin after Main Course came on such a big way. And I like that album too. I can't remember the name of it because I don't have the sleeve. I only got the vinyl. I didn't get even a liner. She's like, oh yeah, you can have this. I don't listen to it anymore. So I did, and I loved it. Now, I do have Main Course. The album that immediately followed it, I do not have the album. I have the singles because I was a singles guy, a kid. I can only afford singles. Excuse me. But more than once, I have listened to Children of the World in its entirety. Children of the World spawned You Should Be Dancing, Love So Right, and Boogie Child as hit singles for them. I'm not really that enamored with Robin's vocal on Love Me, which became another artist hit again, farmed out to another artist, in this case Yvonne Elliman, who did a fantastic job of it in 1976 or early 77. But You Should Be Dancing is a seminal disco song. It is an absolute necessity if you are a disco fan. And of course, one of the scenes in Saturday Night Fever was set to it, even though John Travolta was actually dancing to someone else. We'll talk about that in a minute. And Love So Right, one of the best ballads of the mid-'70s, definitely appropriate for 76 and 77. It had a very smooth R&B feel, but still was still very obviously who it was. Boogie Child, just fun all the way around. Now, the album tracks were great, too. Can't Keep a Good Man Down was good. Children of the World, of course, was great. But those three songs, and Love Me, which I liked better by Yvonne Elliman, were really great songs. And it showed the kind of stuff that they would be doing in less than a year. You Should Be Dancing followed in the footsteps of Jive Talkin', where Barry first used that falsetto. He started honing it a little bit more, and You Should Be Dancing was the result. And again, it's not entirely in falsetto, but what a song! I mean, if you've ever been dancing, even a private club or a private function, and they don't play you should be. For number one, if they don't play You Should Be Dancing, this YMCA and more, then you're not really at a dance. Those three songs are necessities for any kind of good 70s dance party. They are just fantastic. And the reason is because they were terrific. They were writing, writing and recording and producing. By this point, Arif Martin was still working with them because this is the album where they started producing their own stuff because he was no longer available to them because RSO had switched from Atlantic to Polydor for distribution. So they were then put together, the team of Carl Richardson as the engineer, Barry was producing, and Albie Galutin in the control room as an advisor. These three would produce the next several Bee Gees projects, and what they did was freaking amazing. Now, let's talk about the game changer for them, Saturday Night Fever. Saturday Night Fever only contained 5 Bee Gees songs, amongst, I think, 15 total tracks. But Saturday Night Fever is I grew up in the 70s. I'm a pop guy. Even more so, I'm a disco guy. Saturday Night Fever is the album of that entire genre. There is nothing quite like it. It is so full of great music, both new and previously released, and score, that there is a reason why it is the second biggest selling soundtrack of all time, surpassed finally in 2017 by The Bodyguard with Whitney Houston. 40+ million copies of Saturday Night Fever were sold. It's been on several labels. Mine is on RSO. It was later released on Warner Reprise when they were with Warner Brothers. And then now that they own their masters of most everything, including Saturday Night Fever, it's on Capitol. You can still get it in its original form. What an album, and what contributions the Bee Gees made here. In addition to their own hits off this album, they co-wrote or produced 3 or 4 other ones. And Barry was producing other artists on the side, and so was Maurice. They were really becoming the in people in Hollywood. And so everywhere I looked, it was Bee Gees this, Bee Gees that. The Bee Gees are the disco gods. And this album may have disappointed their fans from the 60s that were used to the early stuff. But I'll tell you, it is genius from beginning to end. They had 3 single hits off the album, in order of release: How Deep Is Your Love, Staying Alive, and Night Fever, all of which hit #1. They had an album track hit with More Than a Woman at the same time that the song was out by the R&B band Tavares, also off the soundtrack. Radio was choosing Bee Gees over Tavares at the time. And they produced Yvonne Elliman's If I Can't Have You, and also included You Should Be Dancing and Jive Talking on the album. Now, John Travolta, when he was interviewed about this, said the Bee Gees had not yet written the music when they filmed the movie, which is true. It was post-production stuff that Barry and the brothers were doing. So when you see John in the disco dancing the iconic thing to You Should Be Dancing, he's actually dancing to Lowdown by Boz Scaggs on the set. Which I find hilarious. And to be honest, I don't like the movie. I've seen it twice. I saw the R-rated version. I saw the PG-rated version. I don't like the movie at all. But I do love the soundtrack. Now, in addition to Bee Gees, there were other great acts on here. As I said, a lot of them were produced by Bee Gees, or at least were connected to Bee Gees and got enough into them by then. And while we're talking about the Bee Gees as producers, we're going to talk about 2 other things from that same period. One a huge success, one not so much. The huge success was Grease. Grease was released in July of 1978. Its soundtrack came out in May. And, of course, that ubiquitous summer of 78 I'm always talking about, and we'll eventually get that damn miniseries done. But Barry wrote 2 or 3 pieces, including the new title track for the film. Frankie Valli had a monster hit with it. He co-produced it. And then there was the unthinkable. The rehashing of Beatles music in Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I talk about this extensively on the LabelNova on RSO 2. Sgt. Pepper destroyed RSO Records as a whole. It destroyed their track record. It destroyed their financing. It pretty much caused them to bottom out to the point where Robert Stigwood would sell the label in 1981, and Polygram would phase it out by 1983. Not to say that the Bee Gees would not bounce back. They did, but only for one album. But Sgt. Pepper was a monster and an abomination all its own. Now, Kim can't sit through this movie. We watched it once during... when we were hosting our show, Subject Cinema, we did a feature every year called Masochistic March. We would watch bad films of a particular genre and talk about them. Sgt. Pepper was one of those. She has never forgiven me for that. Now, I've seen the movie. I think Sgt. Pepper is likably bad. It's fun bad. It's fun to sit there and poke fun at it. And some of the music is fine for what it is. Beatles stuff. It's not easy to remake Beatles stuff. Julie Taymor's Across the Universe did it better. All This in World War II did it better, which was a documentary that bombed in the mid-70s that the Bee Gees also contributed to. This soundtrack is awful. Not that they do bad. I mean, they're still the Bee Gees. They record and sing terrific on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But it's so overshadowed by the horrific performances as actors that you can't get past it, even just listening to the album. Robin had a hit off of the album with "Oh Darlin'." It peaked at number 18, I believe, on the Hot 100. Um, and there were a couple other hits for Earth, Wind, and Fire, "Got to Get You Into My Life," and Aerosmith, "Come Together," both on Columbia, from that album. But mostly, it is an album that Bee Gees fans don't talk about. And there's a reason for that. I am not your average Bee Gees fan, so I am not afraid to talk about it. But because I actually do enjoy watching the film. It's fun as hell because it is so bad. It is hysterical. Um, but not everybody does. And especially Beatles fans who just consider it like sent straight from the bowels of hell. So, and in all honesty, I can't say I blame them. But, you know, thankfully they bounced back. 1979 saw the release of Spirits Having Flown. Spirits Having Flown was a number one album on its release. It produced 3 more number one hits, their final top 40 hits for the next 10 years. And it is probably my second favorite Bee Gees album. Again, it is full of disco tunes. It is full of great stuff. The number one hits in order were "Too Much Heaven," "Tragedy," and "Love You Inside Out." It's also known for the title track. And "I'm Satisfied" was re-recorded by somebody else. I don't remember who did another version of that. I think it was a country singer. But Spirits Having Flown, if you had lost some of your faith in the Bee Gees after Sgt. Pepper, this should have restored it. It's an excellent album from beginning to end. A lot of great songs. A couple more album tracks hit the Kirkham Report Top 30 in my unfortunately still missing 1979 chart. "Search," "Find," hit, and I think "Satisfied" did too. Loved that album, loved everything about it. And again, this was the first album where Barry's falsetto was really hard hitting. All of the hits featured Barry's powerful falsetto. Not so much "Too Much Heaven" as "Tragedy" and "Love You Inside Out," because "Too Much Heaven" was a ballad, and "Tragedy" and "Love You Inside Out" were full-on disco songs. But they were great, and I loved every second of them. The problem with disco is 1979 was a watershed year, spurred on by an iconic and yet utterly moronic DJ named Steve Dahl in Chicago, who held a disco demolition night at Kaminsky Park in Chicago in July of 1979 that turned into a legitimate riot. There is a great piece from another person I watch online that did a great breakdown of this, and if I think of it, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But it describes all about what the real motives behind Disco Demolition Night were, and they were not to get rid of disco. But it did have an effect on disco. Disco started fading out as new waves started to make inroads from England, with acts like the Cars from Boston, who were doing a very new wave sound. Gary Newman from the UK. The Buggles would come in eventually. So disco was falling out of favor. They didn't give up, though. In 1981, the Bee Gees released Living Eyes. I am the first person to say this is not the best album they've ever released. In fact, it's far from it. The title track, Living Eyes, is a favorite of mine. And I'm also not afraid to say I do not own this album. I thought I had bought a copy. I may have bought it on CD, so I may own it now, but I didn't when it was originally out, and I did have the singles. Living Eyes missed the top 40 completely, and He's a Liar, the first single, barely made the top 40. It peaked at number 33, I think. It's not a good album. I mean, there's 4 or 5 good songs, And it's well produced. And they did do a song that was not included on the album that would later become a big hit, or sort of big hit, called Heart Stop Beating in Time, which was done on a solo artist, Marilyn McCoo did it. I think it was on the Solid Gold album, although it might have been on the one before that. And it was really well done. And it should have been on the album because they would have done a great job with it. Although I didn't like Love Me the way that they did it, as opposed to the way Yvonne Elliman did it. Maybe because I heard Yvonne's first, because I didn't get Children, like I said, I didn't buy the album Children of the World, and I only heard the singles until later. Living Eyes is a great song. He's a Liar, not so much, and the rest of the album is so-so. The album tanked and was the last big release to come out from RSO. And they would spend the next 6 years regrouping. And what really pisses me off about this 6-year period is the fickleness of the American record buying public. Because in 1987, the Bee Gees released one of their greatest albums of all time, and America stuck their nose up at it. ESP, released in 1987, was a major comeback for them in every other country except the US. You Win Again was a monster hit across the pond, in Australia, in Japan. It peaked at number 80 in the US. No excuse. No excuse, because this album, which I picked up from Columbia House in one of my joining frenzies, is just uncommonly good. Every track is as good as Main Course. Every track is fantastic. And my favorites on the album, in addition to the title track and You Win Again, which were both singles, Giving Up the Ghost, which features Maurice on a rare co-lead vocal, and This Is Your Life, Angela, Crazy for Your Love. These are some of the best songs these guys ever wrote, and they were completely ignored by America. I do not understand that, and it really is disgusting. Now, in the interim between Living Eyes and ESP, they did record some new stuff for the sequel to Saturday Night Fever, Staying Alive. That is best left unsaid. The Woman in You and Someone Belonging to Someone were both good songs. If you want those, they're on one of the collections. I wouldn't bother with the Staying Alive soundtrack, although it's good. The movie itself, I didn't even see. I didn't like the first one, and I don't believe the transition from disco dancer to Broadway dancer for Tony Manero. So, there you are. But that's just me. So, if you have never heard ESP, you need to go out and get it. Now, the other album that I have by them, and I have this on CD, is 1989's One. Imagine my shock when I was driving around in early 1989, listening to, I don't know, I was driving around in Columbus. I was on a record shopping spree. I think my friend Alan was with me, and we were running around on, oh dear, I've forgotten the name of the street. It's actually in Reynoldsburg. It's a Columbus suburb, where Eastland Mall was, and all the shopping districts down there. And I'm listening to, I think, WNCI, which was the #1 channel in Columbus at the time. And this song came on. They didn't announce it. It was on after a break. And I looked at Alan and I said, holy crap, that sounds like the Bee Gees. It was the Bee Gees. It was One. It would be their only top 10 hit in years, and their last top 10 hit in America so far. Well, not so far, of their career. It peaked at number 9 on the chart, and it was an amazing song. But it wasn't the best song on the album. Now, I did buy the album when it came out. It's fabulous. Not as good as ESP, slightly less good. There's a couple songs I'm sort of so-so about. But Bodyguard, which stiffed at top 40 but was a top 10 hit on the AC chart, one of my all-time favorite Bee Gees songs. Bodyguard is really one of those. It's very much in the Hurt So Right, I Love So Right vein. Smooth, soft, incredible keyboards, just the right feel for it. Thankfully, it was a hit at AC and became a monster hit on that format. And some pop stations were playing it. I listened to a station regularly in Mount Vernon, Ohio, that played it a lot. And it was great, and it deserved to be better, but it didn't do that well on the Hot 100. Let me see. I got it up here. Let me see if it... Blah, 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 blah. It missed the top. It missed the Hot 100 entirely. Peaked at number 9 on the AC. I really think it should have been a bigger hit, and I think the album, which did well, it was their biggest hit album since Spirits Having Flown, which spent weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks at number 1. Another song that's really good on this album is the tribute to Andy, who had passed away recently from a viral infection at the age of 30. The song is really an amazing tribute to their brother, and it's called "Wish You Were Here," and Barry and Robin share lead vocals, and it's really beautiful. And Andy was taken way before his time. He did it largely to himself, unfortunately, with his rabid drug use in the late 70s and early 80s. But the Greatest Hits album that came out in 1990 included an unreleased track he had recorded for a new album after getting cleaned up that was never issued because he passed away. I believe the song was called Man on Fire. It was amazing, and I just loved that and really think he would have been back in the top 40 again. Over the next few years, the Bee Gees would continue to release good stuff. I've listened to most of it on Spotify and streaming. There was 1991's High Civilization, which was a big hit overseas. And When He's Gone did get some airplay here in the States. It wasn't a huge hit, but it did get some airplay. I remember hearing it on a few stations in the Columbus area. Then there was Size Isn't Everything in 1993. This time they decided to go back to their pre-Saturday Night Fever sound for this album, and it got some really interesting reviews. Mostly were positive. It was also to celebrate the fact that they were trying to get over a really tough time dealing with drug abuse and alcohol abuse and ill health of family members, and this album was different than anything they'd done in over a decade. And Paying the Price of Love, which was the first single, did not chart here in the States, but it's a great, great song and deserved to. It was also their first song back on Polydor after their Warner Brothers deal ran out. Over the years, they would have just a couple more albums, and then they ceased using the Bee Gees' name when Maurice died suddenly of a heart attack while waiting emergency surgery for a bifracted intestine, I think it was. He was only 53. And Barry and Robin decided they would retire the Bee Gees' name. They would revive the Bee Gees' name later for special performances, no recordings, for special live performances, usually for charity. Although they did make appearances in 2009 on Strictly Come Dancing in the UK and its US counterpart Dancing with the Stars. Doing, here at least, they did You Should Be Dancing, and I think they did one, if I'm not mistaken. They did two of their hits. And it was a reminder of how good their music is. Really is. Robin would pass away in 2012 of liver cancer, complications of pneumonia surrounding it, actually. leaving Barry the only brother left. He has released a solo album, Greenfields, which is not really a solo album. I actually won a copy from Adam in one of his drawings. It's Barry recording with some of today's greatest country and bluegrass artists, and it's really fantastic. If you've never heard it, it's worth it. And they all have had solo stuff out here and there. I was not that keen on Barry's 1983 or 84 album, Shine Shine. Or maybe that was the name of the single. But Robin's solo stuff I took to like a duck out of water. Or like a duck in water. Particularly Juliet, which came out in 1982, and Boys Do Fall in Love, which came out in 84. Love those two songs. And Robin's solo stuff always did outshine Barry and Maurice, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just because of his incredibly unique vibrato. When you hear Robin Gibb sing, you know it's Robin Gibb. Nobody else could do that. Even Barry and Maurice couldn't sing like that. Robin had an amazing voice that was just irreplaceable. And Barry has toured a couple of times since the passings, usually with one of his kids, either his daughter or his son, on stage with him. But he's mostly kept a low profile. Now, of course, when we're talking about the Bee Gees, we have to talk about them as producers as well, and Barry in particular. Going back to their Saturday Night Fever days, in addition to producing Yvonne Elliman's If I Can't Have You, he was also producing a longtime friend of his, Samantha Sang. Many people think of her song Emotion as a Bee Gees song. Even though Barry only does the chorus with that falsetto, that's not him singing the lines, that's Samantha Sang. You can hear the difference in her second single, You Should Be Dancing, which, You Keep Me Dancing, which you can hear her regular voice instead of this breathy Marilyn Monroe type that she used on Emotion. And, I mean, that album is bangers. I picked it up here a couple years ago, but I'd heard it many times before that. And his production work on Emotion was terrific, and it is a classic from 1977 because of Barry's production work. In the early 80s, he would turn his attention to production more and more, mainly because they knew they weren't going to get out of the Living Eyes rut. But before Living Eyes came along, he produced Guilty for Barbra Streisand, which produced Woman in Love, Guilty, and What Kind of Fool. Huge hits. He would later do another album for her in the 90s called Guilty Pleasures, which I've not heard of any of that off of that, but I do know I love Guilty. That album is fabulous, and his duets with her are just stupendously good. He would also produce Kenny Rogers, who had a hit with This Woman and a monster hit with Dolly Parton, Islands in the Stream, under Barry's guidance. He would produce Dionne Warwick, Heartbreaker, and Take the Short Way Home were both produced by Barry. He was phenomenal as a producer in the 80s and 90s. And songwriters, they've always been great songwriters. If I had to list my favorite Bee Gees songs, it would be a big task. I never did it on Rank This. Maybe I will in the future on a special Rank This, but it's hard for me because these guys are so close to me. I like some of the bad stuff, like I.O. I.O., which is not considered one of their biggest hits. In fact, it was a bomb, but I like that song. I also love some of their album tracks, and I adore the disco stuff, particularly Love You Inside Out from Spirits Having Flown and Night Fever from Saturday Night Fever, which I like better than Staying Alive. They are iconic. They are going to be iconic for the rest of time because they produced such music that it's impossible to forget them. Whether you're listening to the early phase of Bee Gees, 1964 to 1967, 68, and then their little broke-up period where it was just Barry and Maurice and Robin solo, and then back together again for that mid-70s period that produced How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, Run to Me, and Lonely Days, and then the disco era, which was Jive Talkin' on Forward. And then the later stuff, which they came back with, like One, Bodyguard. They are not easily dismissed. Now, I have made it a goal of mine to go back and pick up some of the early albums. I never have. I've listened to several of them on, as I said, I listened to several of them when I was younger. I do own one of the earlier albums in crap shape. And I have gone back and listened to some streaming. But I would like to pick up those. One of the albums I've never listened to streaming because I've heard it's a vinyl experience was their album Odessa from 1968. I've heard a couple of songs off of it, but I never heard the whole thing. And I made that a goal of mine to eventually pick up a copy of that and do that. I've heard it was their magnum opus for the time, and that progressive rock people really liked it because it sounded more progressive than what they normally do. But for me, the disco years are where it's at for the Bee Gees. From 1975 to 1981, they were golden. As writers, as singers, as producers, as performers, with that one little black mark called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Okay, it's a big black mark, but still, it's something I always enjoyed, and I always will. I can't get enough of their music. I never stop listening to them. They are always going to be a part of my life. And a lot of their productions will too, particularly the people they led me to. Samantha Sang, I adore. Yvonne Elliman, even though they didn't produce a lot of her stuff, she is one of my favorite female artists of that era. And the stuff Barry produced in the 80s, Barbra Streisand, Dionne Warwick, Kenny Rogers, there were others, all fantastic. I urge you to go back and listen to the different, pick an album from each era and listen to it. And listen to the growth or the change. Sometimes you'll like it, sometimes you won't. But they are always worth it. And always have been. I recognize that with How Can You Mend a Broken Heart. And I jumped in feet first all the way over my head with Main Course in 1975. And I will stay there. Because the Bee Gees, the Brothers Gibb, they are just that damn good. And anyone who tells you otherwise is probably a pissed off Beatles fan. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Influencers. I know I enjoyed talking about it. I love talking about the Bee Gees music. And I hope you'll be back for future installments. I have Season 3 kicked off with Jan Arden. I have installments coming up for a wide variety of people. And I hope that you will watch all the other stuff. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. And if you have, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Please share this out to people that you might like Bee Gees stuff. And please leave a comment. I'm always interested in what you have to say. And if you have any suggestions for stuff I should listen to by the Bee Gees that I may not have heard, some of the early stuff, please do. Let me know what your favorite Bee Gees songs are, what era you liked the best, and why. Because I'm really interested in hearing about it. As always, I have all kinds of shows on here on TKR Video Central at 11 a.m., 4 p.m., and 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and Mixcloud stuff at 7 p.m. on the weekdays and Saturday, and at 11 a.m. and 7 p.m. on Sunday, starting soon. Hasn't started yet. And I'm all over the internet, and I'm all over everybody else's site leaving comments, and I hope that you will be here leaving comments too. If you get a chance, we'd appreciate it if you join our Patreon. It's just $2.99 a month, and we'd appreciate it if you check out our merch. We got all kinds of t-shirts and stuff, in our merch shop. The link is in the show notes. Until next time, for Influencers, I'm TC Kirkham, TKR Video Central, and the Kirkham Report. I will see you on the interwebs as always. Ciao, baby.